The woman buried to her neck in the Texas dirt had stopped praying an hour ago. Now she just stared at the vultures circling overhead, their shadows crossing her face like omens written in a language she was too tired to read. Zephyra Washington's lips had cracked past the point of bleeding. The earth around her shoulders had baked hard as pottery in the afternoon sun. 3 men on horseback had ridden away at dawn, their laughter still echoing in her ears like the sound of breaking glass. The hoofbeats that approached now carried a different rhythm, slower, more careful. A shadow fell across her face. She looked up into dark eyes set in weathered brown skin, framed by long black hair that caught the wind. The man dismounted without speaking, his movements deliberate as he studied the scene before him. Ayanna Stormwalker had been tracking stolen horses for 2 days. He had not expected to find a woman's head rising from the earth like some terrible flower. Their eyes met. Something passed between them in that moment of recognition. 2 people who understood what it meant to be hunted. He knelt beside her and began to dig with his bare hands. The earth came away in chunks. Zephyra felt circulation returning to her arms, pins and needles racing down her shoulders as he worked. Neither of them spoke. The only sounds were his steady breathing and the whisper of dirt falling away from her body. When he finally pulled her free, she collapsed forward onto her hands and knees, gasping. Her wrists bore scars that caught his attention, old marks, but not just from rope or shackles. Something else had made those particular patterns. He helped her to her feet. She swayed but did not fall. From his horse came small voices calling in a language she did not understand. 4 children sat mounted on 2 horses, watching the scene with expressions ranging from curiosity to wariness. The oldest boy, perhaps 16, held the reins of both animals. His jaw was set tight with disapproval. The man who had saved her gestured toward a water skin hanging from his saddle. She nodded. The water was warm, but tasted like salvation. The youngest child, no more than 4 years old, pointed at her and spoke rapidly in Comanche. The man answered in the same tongue, his voice gentle but firm. Zephyra studied her rescuer as he gathered the reins of his horse. Tall and lean, with hands that moved with practiced economy. A warrior, but one who carried children's belongings tied to his saddle. A wooden toy horse, a small blanket worn soft with use. When she looked closer at his saddlebags, she caught sight of paper tucked beneath a leather flap. Even upside down, she could make out the word that had haunted her own dreams for months. Wanted. He noticed her looking, and their eyes met again. This time the recognition carried weight. They were both running from something. The oldest boy spoke sharply to his father in Comanche. Ayanna shook his head and replied in English, his words meant for Zephyra to understand. "Dakota says you will bring trouble. He's right." Her voice came out as a whisper, throat still raw from thirst and screaming. "Trouble already found us long ago." He mounted his horse and extended his hand down to her. She hesitated. Getting on that horse meant accepting help from a man who clearly had his own problems. It meant putting children at risk. It meant admitting she had nowhere else to go. The vultures circled lower. She took his hand. They rode in silence through the late afternoon, the children's horses following behind. Zephyra sat behind Ayanna, trying not to notice how his presence felt solid and warm after hours of believing she would die alone. She kept her hands carefully placed, not wanting to seem forward or desperate, though she was both. The landscape around them told stories of violence. Burned homesteads in the distance. Tracks from cavalry horses crossing and recrossing the same ground. This was contested territory, claimed by too many and belonging to none. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, they reached a small camp hidden in a grove of cottonwoods. Near a creek, more horses. A handful of adults and elderly people who looked up at their approach with faces that had learned to expect bad news. An old woman with silver hair braided with beads stepped forward, Her eyes took in Zephyra's appearance with the quick assessment of someone who had seen suffering before. When she spoke, it was in Comanche, but her tone needed no translation. Ayana answered her in English, again making sure Zephyra could understand. "Grandmother Sage asks what manner of trouble I have brought home. The kind that follows whether you invite it or not." The old woman's expression shifted slightly. Not quite approval, but something close to recognition. She gestured toward the fire where a pot of something that smelled like food was cooking. As they dismounted, the youngest child slipped down from his horse and approached Zephyra with the fearless curiosity of the very young. He held up the wooden toy horse, offering it to her with a gap-toothed smile. She knelt to his level and accepted the toy with appropriate solemnity. The boy giggled and ran back to his siblings. "Little Fox likes you," Ayana said. "Children usually do. Before they learn better." The 12-year-old girl had been watching this exchange with careful eyes. She looked like her father, but with her mother's delicate features. When she spoke, it was with the protective instinct of someone who had already lost too much. "Where is your family?" The question hit Zephyra like a physical blow. Her hand moved unconsciously to her throat, where something small and precious hung hidden beneath her torn dress. A chain so thin it was barely visible. Whatever it held was concealed against her skin. Gone. Ayana's Dawn studied her face with the unsettling directness of children who have learned to read adults for signs of danger or deception. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, at least for now. As darkness settled over the camp, Zephyra found herself sitting by the fire with a bowl of stew that tasted better than anything she could remember eating. The children had arranged themselves around their father, the two youngest leaning against his sides while the older ones maintained careful distance from the stranger in their midst. She watched Yana's hands as he ate, gentle when he helped Baby Crow with his food, patient when Little Fox spilled on himself. These were not the hands of a man who hurt people without cause, but they were also the hands of someone who would hurt people if cause presented itself. The wanted poster hidden in his saddlebags suggested he already had. When the children began to yawn, Ayana stood and began the evening ritual of getting them settled for sleep. Dakota was old enough to need little assistance, but still young enough to accept a brief touch on the shoulder from his father. Ayana's Dawn helped with the younger ones, her movements carrying the practiced efficiency of someone who had taken on adult responsibilities too early. Little Fox looked around the group and spoke in Comanche, pointing at Zephyra. "He asks where you will sleep," Ayana translated. She had been wondering the same thing. In the slave quarters, there had always been a place, even if it was only a corner of the floor. Here, she was neither family nor servant, neither guest nor prisoner. She existed in some undefined space that made everyone uncomfortable. "I can keep watch. Someone should. You need rest." "I need to earn my keep." Grandmother Sage had been listening to this exchange from her place by the fire. She spoke briefly in Comanche, then rose and walked to a bundle of blankets near her own sleeping area. She pulled out a worn but clean blanket and brought it to Zephyra. "She says you have already paid your dues for today," Ayana said. The old woman's kindness was almost harder to bear than the cruelty she had escaped. Zephyra accepted the blanket with a nod that she hoped conveyed gratitude beyond words. As the camp settled into sleep, she arranged her blanket at the edge of the firelight, close enough to be part of the group, far enough away to run, if necessary. But as she lay there staring up at stars that looked the same as they had when she was buried in the earth, she realized something had changed. For the first time in months, running felt like a choice rather than a desperate necessity. The youngest child, Baby Crow, woke in the deep part of the night crying for his mother. Ayana rose immediately, but the boy's sobs only grew louder. The sound cut through the darkness like a blade, full of grief too large for such a small body to contain. Zephyra found herself sitting up, then standing, then walking toward the sound before her mind had time to make the decision. She knelt beside Ayana, who was holding his son but failing to comfort him. She began to hum, low and soft, a melody her own mother had sung during the worst nights on the plantation. A song about finding rest when rest seemed impossible. Baby Crow's crying subsided to hiccups, then to silence. He reached out one small hand toward Zephyra, and after a moment's hesitation, Ayana transferred the child to her arms. The boy settled against her chest and fell asleep within minutes. When she looked up, she found Ayana watching her with an expression she could not read. Gratitude, certainly, but something else underneath it. Something that looked almost like recognition. She tried to hand the sleeping child back to his father, but Ayana shook his head. He has not slept through the night since his mother died, if you do not mind. So she spent her first night of freedom holding a Comanche child who had lost his mother, while his father sat nearby keeping watch over them both. In the morning, she would have to face the reality of what it meant to be a runaway slave traveling with a band of displaced Comanche. She would have to confront the dangers that her presence brought to these people who had shown her kindness. But for now, in the darkness between her buried past and her uncertain future, she held a motherless child and felt something she had not experienced in years. She felt needed. Dawn brought the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A single rider emerged from the morning mist, his horse lathered with sweat and urgency. Red Hawk dismounted before his animal had fully stopped, his face carrying news that would change everything. Ayana rose from the fire where he had been watching Zephyra help little Fox with his breakfast. The easy peace of the morning cracked under the weight of Red Hawk's expression. The scout spoke rapidly in Comanche, his words tumbling over each other like stones down a cliff face. Ayana's jaw tightened with each sentence. Around the fire, the other adults stopped their morning tasks to listen. Bounty hunters, Ayana said in English, his eyes finding Zephyrs across the flames. 3 days behind us, maybe less. How many? Grandmother Sage asked. 6, well armed. They are asking questions in every settlement between here and the border. Zephyra set down the bowl she had been holding. Her hands remained steady, but something in her posture changed. She was already calculating distances, escape routes, the weight of what she carried against the speed she could manage on foot. There is more, Red Hawk continued. The cavalry has posted a reward for the man who killed Captain Morrison. The camp fell silent. Even the children seemed to sense the shift in the air, the way animals know when storms are coming. Ayana touched the knife at his belt, a gesture so brief it might have been unconscious. How much? $50. Grandmother Sage made a sound deep in her throat. $50 could buy horses, ammunition, safe passage to Mexico. It could buy survival for the whole band. And for her? Red Hawk's eyes moved to Zephyra. 30. More if they take her back alive. $80 total. Enough to change everything for these displaced people who had already lost their homes, their hunting grounds, their way of life. Zephyra felt the weight of that sum settling on her shoulders like a mantle of guilt. Dakota stood abruptly, his young face hard with the kind of certainty that comes before wisdom. We should consider it. Dakota. Ayana's voice carried a warning. You would sacrifice your own father for silver? Ayana's Dawn stepped closer to her brother, her chin raised in defiance. I would save my family. The words hung in the air between them, sharp as broken glass. Little Fox looked back and forth. Between his siblings, confusion clouding his features. Baby Crow began to fuss, sensing the tension, even if he could not understand its source. Zephyra rose from her place by the fire. Every eye in the camp followed her movement. The boy is right. No. Ayana moved to block her path, though she had not been walking toward anything in particular. We do not trade people. Even when keeping them will cost you everything, especially then. The conviction in his voice was absolute, but she could See the calculation behind his eyes. He was weighing the safety of his children against the principles that defined him as a man. It was a cruel mathematics with no clean solutions. Red Hawk cleared his throat. There is something else. The bounty. Hunters are not alone. They travel with a man who wears the uniform of the Indian Agency. He carries papers that give him authority over all tribal matters in this territory. Grandmother Sage spat into the fire. The flames hissed and jumped, casting dancing shadows. Across her weathered face, "William Hartwell," she said. "That one has been selling rifles to the war parties up north. He blames the raids on peaceful bands to cover his tracks." "You know this for certain?" Ayanna asked. "I know the smell of corruption. It carries on the wind." Zephyra listened to this exchange with growing understanding. The danger surrounding this camp extended far beyond her own troubles. These people were caught in currents of violence and greed that had been flowing long before she arrived. She walked to the edge of the camp where the creek ran clear over smooth stones. The water reflected the sky, blue and endless, indifferent to human suffering. She knelt and cupped the cold liquid in her hands, drinking deeply while her mind worked through possibilities. Behind her, the adults continued their discussion in voices that grew more heated, despite their attempts at control. The children had gathered near their father, instinctively seeking protection from conflicts they could not fully understand. When she returned to the fire, she found Ayanna's Dawn sorting through a collection of dried plants and roots. The girls' movements were precise, practiced. She was preparing medicine. "Where did you learn that?" Zephyra asked. "My mother, before she died." The simple statement carried years of grief compressed into a handful of words. Zephyra recognized the weight of it, the way loss could settle into a person's bones and change how they moved through the world. "She taught you well." Ayanna's Dawn looked up from her work, studying Zephyra's face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read people for signs of sincerity or deception. "Do you know medicine?" "Some. My grandmother was a healer." Sold away. "When I was 12. The girl nodded as if this made perfect sense, as if the casual destruction of families was simply another fact of life to be accepted and endured. Her hands continued their work, selecting roots and bark with the confidence of inherited knowledge. "You could help me gather more supplies. The little ones get sick when we travel too much." It was an invitation wrapped in practicality, an offer of usefulness that would justify Zephyra's continued presence in the camp. She accepted with a nod that conveyed more gratitude than words could carry. They spent the morning walking the creek banks and examining the plants that grew in the shade of the cottonwoods. Ayanna's Dawn proved to be a careful teacher, explaining the properties of each root and leaf with the patience of someone who understood that knowledge was survival. As they worked, Little Fox appeared at their side, curious about their activities. He chattered in a mixture of Comanche and broken English, his enthusiasm infectious despite the morning's grim news. When Zephyra showed him how to identify a particular healing plant, he clapped his hands in delight. "You are good with children," Ayanna's Dawn observed. Zephyra's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, where the hidden chain lay warm against her skin. "I had practice once." The girl waited for more explanation, but when none came, she simply nodded and continued her gathering. She had learned early that some stories were too painful to tell, and some silences were more respectful than questions. They returned to camp with their arms full of medicinal plants to find the adults still deep in discussion. The conversation had evolved beyond immediate danger to encompass larger questions of survival and responsibility. Where could they go that would be safe? How long could they keep running? What did they owe each other in these desperate times? Red Hawk had unsaddled his horse and settled in for a longer stay. This meant the news he carried was complicated enough to require careful planning rather than immediate flight. As the day wore on, Zephyra found herself drawn into the rhythm of camp life. She helped with food preparation, her knowledge of which plants were edible proving valuable. She mended a tear in Little Fox's shirt while he sat patiently, telling her stories in his mixed language that made her smile despite everything. When Baby Crow grew fussy in the afternoon heat, she took him to the shade by the creek and sang the lullabies her mother had taught her. The child's breathing deepened and steadied. His small fist curled against her chest as he slept. Ayana found them there as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. He stood watching for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He has not slept peacefully during the day since his mother died. Children know when they are safe, do they? The question carried weight beyond its simple words. She looked up at him, this man who had pulled her from the earth and given her sanctuary, who now faced impossible choices because of her presence in his life. Your son feels loved. That is a kind of safety. And you? Do you feel safe? The question surprised her with its directness. She considered it carefully, watching the sleeping child in her arms, listening to the sounds of family around her. I feel needed. That is better than safe. As evening approached, Little Fox developed a fever. It began as restlessness and fussing, but quickly escalated to burning skin and labored breathing. The camp mobilized with the efficiency of people who had faced medical crises before, but their concern was palpable. Ayana's dawn brought her collection of medicinal plants, but her hands shook as she tried to prepare the remedies. The responsibility of healing her little brother pressed down on her 12-year-old shoulders like a physical weight. Let me help, Zephyra offered. Together, they worked through the night. Zephyra's grandmother had taught her about fevers, about the delicate balance between cooling the body and maintaining its strength. She guided Ayana's dawn through the preparation of tinctures and poultices, her calm presence steadying the girl's nervous energy. Ayana sat beside his son's makeshift bed, bathing the boy's forehead with cool water. His movements were gentle, but desperate, the helplessness of a father watching his child suffer written in every line of his body. Tell me about the captain you killed, Zephyra said quietly as they worked, his hands stilled for a moment. Why? Because your son needs you to stay calm, and talking about it might help. He was silent for so long she thought he would not answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he began to speak. Captain Morrison led the raid on our winter camp. 23 people died. Women, children, elders who could not run fast enough. His wife had been among them. Cut down while trying to protect other children who were not even her own. I tracked him for 3 weeks. Found him in a saloon in Abilene, drunk and bragging about his victory over the savage red men. And then I broke his neck with my bare hands. The confession hung between them like smoke from the fire. Zephyra continued preparing the medicine, her hands steady despite the weight of what she had just heard. Do you regret it? I regret that it will not bring her back. Little Fox's fever broke near dawn. His breathing eased and his skin cooled, the crisis passing as suddenly as it had arrived. Ayana's dawn collapsed against Zephyra's shoulder, exhausted by the night's vigil. You saved him, the girl whispered. We saved him. But as they cleaned up the remnants of their medical supplies, Zephyra noticed the looks passing between the adults. Dakota's expression had softened from hostility to something approaching respect. Even some of the other band members who had been skeptical of her presence now nodded their acknowledgement. She had proven her worth, but in doing so, she had also made herself indispensable. And indispensable people were harder to sacrifice when hard choices had to be made. Red Hawk approached as they settled the sleeping child more comfortably. His expression was grave, the bearer of news that could not wait for a more convenient time. The bounty hunters have been seen at Johnson's Creek. They will be here by tomorrow evening. The words fell into the morning, quiet like stones into still water, sending ripples of fear and determination through the camp. Decisions could no longer be postponed. The luxury of debate was over. Grandmother Sage stood slowly, her joints protesting. The movement after a night spent in worried vigil. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had survived too much to be frightened by anything less than certainty. Then we must choose, all of us, together. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mist that had shrouded the creek. In the growing light, each face around the fire became clear and distinct, marked by the weight of choice and the knowledge that whatever they decided would change them all forever. The council fire burned low as the adults gathered in a circle. That felt more like a tribunal. Little Fox slept peacefully in his father's lap, his fever broken, but his presence a reminder of what they all stood to lose. The other children had been sent to rest, but Dakota remained, his 16 years earning him a voice in decisions that would shape their survival. Red Hawk had drawn a map in the dirt with a stick, marking the positions of the bounty hunters and the best routes toward the Mexican border. The mathematics of their situation lay bare in those scratched lines. 6 armed men closing from the east. Open prairie to the south offering no cover. Mountains to the west that would slow them down and expose them to winter weather. $80, said one of the older men, his voice heavy with the weight of practical thinking. That sum could buy us safe passage, new horses, supplies for the children. Grandmother Sage stirred the fire with a long branch, sending sparks spiraling into the dark sky. And what would we buy it with? Our souls. Our souls will not feed the children if we all starve in Mexico. The debate continued in circles, each argument leading back to the same impossible choice. Sacrifice 2 to save many, or risk everyone for principle. The fire crackled and popped, consuming itself as surely as they were consuming each other, with words that cut deeper than knives. Zephyra sat outside the circle, close enough to hear, but far enough away to preserve the fiction that the decision was not about her. She watched Ayana's face in the firelight, seeing the war between his protective instincts and his moral convictions playing out in the tension around his eyes. Dakota finally spoke, his young voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone. We are not talking about strangers. We are talking about family. The words fell into the circle like stones into deep water. Around the fire, faces turned toward the boy who had spent days arguing for practical solutions over sentiment. She saved little Fox. She works beside us. She holds baby Crow when he cries for his mother. Dakota's hands clenched and unclenched. In his lap, if we sell her for silver, what are we? Alive, said the practical man, dead inside. Ayana shifted his sleeping son to his other arm and reached out to touch his eldest boy's shoulder. Pride and grief warred in his expression as he recognized the man his son was becoming. And me? Ayana asked quietly. What value do you place on my life? The question hung in the air unanswered. They all knew he would never allow them to trade Zephyra while keeping himself safe. If they chose the bounty money, they would be choosing to lose them both. Grandmother Sage stood slowly, her joints protesting the movement. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of prophecy. I have lived long enough to see many choices. Like this one. The people who choose silver over principle never find the peace they seek. The money runs out. The shame remains. She walked to the edge of the circle and stared out into the darkness where their enemies approached. But I have also buried too many children to count. And the dead do not care about our principles. Her words settled over the group like ash from a burned-out fire. She had given them no easy answers, only the acknowledgement that some choices leave stains on the soul, regardless of what is decided. Red Hawk cleared his throat. There may be another way. Every head turned toward him. In the firelight, his face looked carved from stone. The Indian agent who travels with them, Hartwell. He has been asking questions about more than just wanted fugitives. He wants to know about our weapons, our numbers, our plans. What does that matter? Dakota asked. It matters because men who ask those questions usually have reasons beyond law enforcement. He is planning something larger than capturing 2 people. Grandmother Sage returned to the circle, her movements suddenly alert despite her age. What kind of something? The kind that requires all the witnesses to disappear. The implication hit them like a physical blow. If Red Hawk was right, surrender might not buy safety for anyone. It might simply make the killing easier to accomplish. Ayana's dawn appeared at the edge of the firelight, her face pale with fear and determination. She had been listening from the shadows, unable to sleep while the adults decided her family's fate. Then we fight. We are 12 adults and 7 children against 6 armed bounty hunters and a corrupt government official. Her father said gently, "Fighting is not survival, neither is surrender." The girl's words carried an echo of her mother's fierce spirit. Around the fire, the adults exchanged glances that spoke of recognition and sorrow. She was right, but being right would not stop. Bullets or changed the mathematics of their situation. Zephyra stood slowly, feeling every eye turn toward her. The time for sitting outside the circle had passed. "I will go." "No." Ayana's response was immediate and absolute. "If Red Hawk is right, my leaving will not save you. But my staying will certainly doom you." She walked to the fire and knelt beside it, her hands extended toward the warmth. The flames danced across her palms, casting shifting shadows on her scarred wrists. "I have been running for 8 months. I am tired of being the reason good people suffer." "You are not the reason," Grandmother Sage said firmly. "Evil men are the reason. You are just the excuse they use. The excuse is enough to get these children killed." Baby Crow stirred in his father's arms, making small sounds of distress even in sleep. Ayana rocked him gently, his movements automatic and protective. The sight of that unconscious tenderness struck Zephyra like a blow to the chest. "I had a son once," she said quietly. The confession emerged without her conscious decision to speak it. Around the fire, everyone grew still. He was 4 years old, smart and brave and curious about everything. Her hand moved to her throat, touching the hidden chain beneath her dress. When we tried to escape, he could not run fast enough. The dogs caught him first. The silence that followed was profound. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly, as if the flames themselves were listening. I have spent every day since then believing I failed him. That I was not strong enough, not fast enough, not smart enough to save my own child. She looked around the circle, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. I will not fail another child. Not these children. Not when I have the power to lead danger away from them. Dakota leaned forward, his young face intense with emotion. You also have the power to stay and help us face it together. Together we are stronger, Little Fox said from behind them, his voice weak but determined. No one had noticed him wake up, but there he stood in his nightclothes, swaying slightly from his recent illness. You should be sleeping, his sister scolded, but her voice was gentle. Cannot sleep when family is in danger. The simple statement from the 8-year-old boy carried more weight than all the adult arguments that had preceded it. He walked to Zephyra and took her hand in his. Small one, his skin still warm from fever. But his grip surprisingly strong. You are family now. The words broke something inside her chest that she had been holding closed for months. She knelt to his level and touched his face with trembling fingers. Family does not abandon family. He continued with the absolute certainty of childhood. Mama told me that before she went to the spirit world. Around the fire, she could see the decision forming in their faces. Not the practical calculation of survival odds, but the deeper choice about what kind of people they would be in the face of impossible circumstances. Red Hawk stood abruptly, his hand moving to the rifle across his back. Riders coming. The sound reached them a moment later. Hoofbeats approaching fast from the east. Too many horses for friendly visitors. The council dissolved into rapid motion. As adults grabbed weapons and children were hustled toward the horses. How many? Ayana asked, settling his own rifle in his hands. 6, maybe 7. They had run out of time for decisions. The choice was being made for them by men with guns and government papers, riding through the darkness with intentions that extended far beyond simple law enforcement. Grandmother Sage moved with surprising speed for her age, gathering essential supplies and herding the children toward their escape route. But as she worked, she caught Zafira's eye and held it for a long moment. "Sometimes the spirits make our choices for us," she said quietly. "But they do not make them without reason." The hoofbeats grew louder, close enough now to distinguish individual horses, close enough to hear the jingle of spurs and weapons, the low voices of men who believed they held all the advantages. Ayana appeared at Zafira's side, his children gathered around him in a tight group. Baby Crow was awake now, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that children feel when the adults around them are afraid. "Whatever happens," Ayana said quietly, "we face it together." She nodded, her hand finding his in the darkness. His fingers were warm and calloused from years of work and worry, but they held hers with steady strength. The riders emerged from the shadows like demons made manifest, their horses snorting and stamping as they formed a loose circle around the camp. In the firelight, their faces looked carved from cruelty and greed. The man at their center wore the uniform of the Indian Agency, his brass buttons catching the flames as he dismounted. William Hartwell smiled with the confidence of someone who had never lost a game that mattered. "Good evening," he said, his voice carrying the false courtesy of absolute power. "I believe you have something that belongs to us." Behind him, the bounty hunters arranged themselves with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this before. Their hands rested on their weapons, ready but not yet desperate. The moment had arrived. All their planning and arguing and soul-searching had led to this circle of firelight surrounded by armed men with government papers and private agendas. But as Zephyra looked around at the faces of the people who had called her family, she realized that something had changed in the past few minutes. The fear was still there, but underneath it was something harder and more dangerous. They had made their choice after all. Not through debate or calculation, but through the simple act of standing together when the darkness came calling. Now, they would discover what that choice would cost them all. The shot came from the darkness beyond the firelight, sudden and sharp as breaking bone. Hartwell spun and dropped, clutching his shoulder as his men wheeled their horses toward the unseen threat. In the chaos that followed, Ayana grabbed Zafira's hand and pulled her toward the creek where the children waited with the horses. "Move," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the shouting. They ran low through the cottonwoods, branches catching at their clothes and faces. Behind them, more gunfire erupted as the bounty hunters fired blind into the shadows, their discipline shattered by the unexpected attack. Red Hawk materialized beside them, his rifle smoking. Grandmother Sage, she circled around behind them while they were watching us. The old woman had bought them precious minutes with her cunning, but minutes would not be enough. They reached the horses to find the children already mounted, their faces pale with terror but their bodies steady with the kind of courage that comes from having no other choice. Ayana lifted Baby Crow onto his horse and swung up behind him. "The cave system by Eagle Rock. You remember the way?" Dakota nodded, his hands tight on his reins. "What about Grandmother Sage? She knows how to disappear. She will find us when she can." They rode hard through the darkness, following deer trails and creek beds that would hide their tracks from casual pursuit. The children held on without complaint, their small bodies adapting to the rhythm of flight with the resilience of those who had already lost one home to violence. Behind them, the sounds of confusion gradually faded into the night. But Zephyra knew the silence was temporary. Men like Hartwell did not give up easily, especially when wounded pride mixed with financial incentive. The caves lay hidden in a maze of red sandstone, formations that had been carved by centuries of wind and water into fantastic shapes. Ayana led them through passages so narrow they had to dismount and lead the horses single file, the sound of their breathing echoing off stone walls that had sheltered his people for generations. They emerged into a circular chamber lit by moonlight, filtering through cracks in the ceiling. Ancient paintings covered the walls, handprints and animal figures left by people whose names were forgotten, but whose spirits still watched over this sacred place. The children collapsed against the cave walls, exhaustion finally claiming now that they had reached temporary safety. Little Fox curled up against his sister, still weak from his recent fever. Baby Crow whimpered for his father, who gathered him close and began the quiet ritual of comfort that had become as natural as breathing. Ayana's Dawn took charge of settling the younger ones, her movements efficient despite her own fear. At 12, she had learned to be a mother when circumstances demanded it. The responsibility sat heavy on her narrow shoulders, but she carried it without complaint. Red Hawk posted himself at the cave entrance, his rifle ready and his eyes scanning the darkness for signs of pursuit. The bounty hunters would need time to regroup and tend to Hartwell's wound, but they would come. Men with government papers and wounded pride were dangerous in ways that simple greed could never match. Zephyra found herself alone with Ayana. At the back of the cave, where a small spring provided fresh water and the sound of dripping created a steady rhythm that spoke of permanence in a world that had become all movement and change. "Your grandmother saved us," she said quietly. "She saved herself too. That woman has been outsmarting dangerous men since before I was born." He knelt beside the spring and cupped water in his hands, drinking deeply before offering the same courtesy to her. The water was cold and clean, tasting of stone and darkness and the deep places where life persisted, despite everything the surface world could throw at it. "The children cannot keep running forever," she said. "I know, and you cannot keep them safe while you are a wanted man. I know that too." He sat back against the cave wall, Baby Crow sleeping in his arms, and looked at her with eyes that held too much knowledge of loss and compromise. "Tell me about your son." The request came quietly, without demand or expectation. Simply an invitation to share the burden she had been carrying alone for too long. His name was Samuel, after my father, who was sold away before I could remember. His face. She drew her knees up to her chest and rested her chin on them, making herself small in the way people do when touching old wounds. He had my mother's eyes and my stubborn streak. Always asking questions about everything. Why is the sky blue? Where do the birds go when it rains? Why cannot we leave this place and go somewhere better? Ayana listened without interruption, his presence steady and warm beside her in the darkness. I used to tell him stories at night, about places where children could run free and families stayed together and no one owned anyone else. He believed those places were real. He made me believe it too. The spring continued its patient dripping, marking time in a place where time seemed suspended between past and future. When we ran, he was so excited. He thought we were going to one of those magical places from the stories. He packed his few treasures in a cloth bundle and carried it on his back without complaining, even when it slowed him down. Her hand moved to her throat, touching the chain that held his memory against her heart. The dogs found us on the third day. He could not run fast enough with his little legs. I tried to carry him, but I was not strong enough for both of us. What happened? The overseer shot him. Said it would teach the other children not to get ideas about running away. The words fell into the silence between them like stones, into deep water. Ayana reached out slowly and covered her hand with his fingers warm and steady against her trembling ones. "His name was Samuel," he repeated, giving the boy's memory the weight of acknowledgement. "Samuel Washington. He would have been 5 years old next month." They sat together in the darkness, two parents who had lost children to the casual cruelty of men who treated other human beings as property to be managed or disposed of according to convenience. My wife's name was Morning Star, Ayana said eventually. She died protecting children who were not even ours. Threw herself between them and the soldiers' guns. She sounds brave. She was everything good about this world, everything worth protecting. Baby Crow stirred in his arms, making small sounds of distress even in sleep. Ayana rocked him gently, his movements automatic and practiced. I used to dream about her after she died. She would come to me and tell me things. About the children, about what I needed to do to keep them safe. Do you still dream of her? Yes, but the dreams changed after I found you buried in that field. Zephyra waited, understanding that some truths needed time and silence to emerge. She told me I would find someone who needed saving, but that saving her would save me too. I am not sure I am worth saving. Neither was I until I pulled you out of that ground and watched you hold my son while he cried for his mother. The admission hung between them, fragile and profound. Around them, the cave held its ancient silence, keeping their secret safe, in the way it had protected countless others who had sought shelter within its walls. The bounty hunters will find us eventually, she said. Yes, and when they do, we face them together. All of us. That could get your children killed. Running could get them killed too. At least this way we choose how we meet whatever. Commies. She understood then that this was not about tactics or survival odds. It was about the kind of people they would be in the face of impossible circumstances. The kind of legacy they would leave for the children who depended on them. I am afraid, she admitted. Good. Fear keeps you careful. I am afraid of caring too much. Of having something to lose again. Too late for that. He was right. Somewhere between being dug out of the ground and sitting in this cave with his sleeping son in her arms, and his other children depending on her presence, she had crossed a line she had sworn never to cross again. She had allowed herself to love people who could be taken away. Samuel would have liked your children, she said. They would have liked him too. Outside the cave, the wind picked up, carrying with it the sound of distant thunder. Rain was coming, which would help hide their tracks but would also make the cave cold and miserable for the children. Practical concerns intruded on the moment of connection, reminding them that survival required constant attention to detail. But as they moved to tend to their responsibilities, something had shifted between them. They were no longer two separate people thrown together by circumstances. They had become something more complex and dangerous and precious. They had become a family worth fighting for. Morning Star appeared to him in his dreams that night, as she had so many times before. But this time she was not alone. Beside her stood a woman he had never seen, but who looked at him with Zephyra's eyes. The path you have chosen will cost you everything, Morning Star said. I know, and give you everything in return. I hope. Hope is enough, said the other woman, her voice carrying the accent of the Deep South and the weight of unimaginable loss. Hope is always enough. When he woke, Zephyra was sitting by the dying embers of their small fire, keeping watch while the others slept. She looked up as he stirred, and in her eyes he saw the same recognition that had passed between them by the spring. They were bound now by more than circumstances or convenience. They were bound by choice and hope and the terrible courage it took to build something beautiful in a world determined to tear it down. Outside, the rain had begun to fall, washing the desert clean and filling the hidden places with the promise of new growth. 3 days in the caves had stretched their supplies thin and their nerves thinner. The children grew restless despite their exhaustion, and the adults took turns standing watch at the entrance where Red Hawk reported movement in the valley below. The bounty hunters had found their trail. On the morning of the 4th day, Grandmother Sage appeared at the cave mouth like a spirit materialized from stone and shadow. Her clothes were torn and dusty, but her eyes burned with the fierce satisfaction of someone who had accomplished exactly what she set out to do. They are coming, she announced without preamble. 6 men, all armed, and Heartwell wearing his arm in a sling but still giving orders. "How long do we have?" Ayanna asked. "Until sunset. Maybe less if they find the hidden path." The children gathered around their elders, sensing the weight of approaching crisis. Baby Crow clung to Zephyrah's skirts, while Little Fox pressed close to his father's side. Only Dakota and Ayanna's Dawn seemed ready for whatever came next, their young faces set with determination that belonged to people far older than their years. "There is something else," Grandmother Sage continued. "I followed them long enough to hear their plans. They do not intend to take prisoners." The words settled over the group like dust from a collapsed mine. Zephyrah felt her chest tighten with the familiar weight of being the cause of other people's danger. "Heartwell knows we can identify him as the source of those weapons sales to the hostile tribes. He cannot risk us reaching anyone with authority to investigate his activities. Red Hawk spat into the cave floor, so we die either way. Fighting or surrendering, maybe not." All eyes turned to Zephyrah, who had been sitting quietly in the shadows with the sleeping baby crow in her arms. She stood slowly, settling the child against his father's chest before walking to the center of their circle. "What if we could prove his crimes to someone with more authority than he has?" "Who?" Dakota asked. "He carries papers from the territorial government. Then we need someone from the federal government." Grandmother Sage studied her with sharp eyes. "Such a person would have to be very close, and very interested in stopping corruption among Indian agents. Judge Samuel Morrison arrives in Abilene today to hear territorial disputes. I can read his schedule in the papers Heartwell carries." The admission that she could read drew surprised looks from several adults, but Ayanna only nodded as if he had suspected as much. "Even if that is true, how do we reach him? We are trapped in these caves with armed men hunting us." Zephyrah walked to the cave entrance and stared out at the red rock formations that stretched toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond those stones lay the town of Abilene and a federal judge, who might represent their only chance at justice instead of merely survival. "We do not all have to reach him. One person could slip past them in the darkness and ride hard for town." "One person would not be believed," Red Hawk pointed out. "Not against a man with official papers and a badge. One person with evidence would be." She turned back to face them, her mind working through possibilities that felt dangerous and desperate and absolutely necessary. "Heartwell keeps records. Men who sell weapons to both sides of a conflict always keep records, in case they need to blackmail someone later. Those records would be proof enough for any honest judge." "Those records would be in his saddlebags," Ayanna said quietly. "Surrounded by 6 armed men who want us dead. Then we give them a reason to leave those saddlebags unguarded." The plan that emerged from their desperate conference was built on timing, misdirection, and the kind of calculated risk that people take only when all other options have been exhausted. It required splitting their group and depending on the enemy's assumptions about their behavior. Most importantly, it required Zephyrah and Ayanna to surrender themselves while the others created a diversion that would draw the bounty hunters away from their camp. "I do not like it," Dakota said for the 4th time as they made their final preparations. "Neither do I," his father replied. "But disliking the plan does not make it wrong." They waited until the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the rocks in shades of gold and crimson that spoke of ending things. The children had been given their instructions and their escape routes, though everyone hoped those routes would not be needed. Grandmother Sage would lead them to safety if the plan failed. Red Hawk would create the diversion that would scatter the bounty hunters across the valley floor. Dakota would ride hard for Abilene with whatever evidence they could gather. And Zephyrah and Ayanna would walk into the guns of 6 desperate men and gamble their lives on the assumption that greed would overcome caution at the crucial moment. They emerged from the caves as the light began to fade, their hands raised in apparent surrender. Below them in the valley, The bounty hunters had made camp near a small stream. Their horses picketed nearby, and their confidence evident in the casual way they had arranged their bedrolls. Hartwell stood as they approached, his wounded arm held stiffly against his side, but his gun hand steady and ready. His face bore the particular expression of a man who had been personally inconvenienced, and intended to extract payment for that inconvenience. "The famous Ayanna Stormwalker," he said, his voice carrying false courtesy over genuine malice, "and his rescued property." Zephyra felt the familiar burn of being reduced to a thing rather than a person, but she kept her expression neutral. Everything depended on these men underestimating what she was capable of understanding and doing. "We are here to negotiate," Ayanna said. "There is nothing to negotiate. You killed a cavalry officer. She killed her owner's son. The territorial government wants you both dead or alive, and frankly, dead seems easier." "Easier for whom?" "Hartwell's." Smile was sharp as a blade edge, for everyone involved. Dead fugitives cannot contradict official reports about what happened and why. The admission came so casually that for a moment Zephyra wondered if she had misheard. But the bounty hunters around the fire shifted uncomfortably, and she realized that some of them had not been told the full extent of Hartwell's plans. "You intend to kill us regardless of surrender," she said. "I intend to tie up loose ends. You have seen too much and know too much about activities that are none of your concern." One of the bounty hunters, a grizzled man with scars across his cheek, looked up from cleaning his rifle. "You did not mention killing prisoners when you hired us, Hartwell. I mentioned doing whatever was necessary to complete the job. There is a difference between capturing fugitives and murdering people in cold blood." Hartwell's hand dropped to his sidearm, but before he could draw, the sound of gunfire erupted from the rocks above them. Red Hawk had begun his diversion. Exactly on schedule, his shots echoing off the canyon walls and making it impossible to determine how many attackers they faced. The bounty hunters scattered toward cover, their professional instincts overriding their moral concerns about Hartwell's intentions. In the confusion, Zephyra threw herself toward the saddlebags that had been dropped beside the fire. Her fingers found the leather pouch where Hartwell kept his papers just as his boot caught her in the ribs, sending her rolling away from the fire. But she held onto the pouch, clutching it against her chest as Ayanna tackled the Indian agent and sent them both crashing into the stream. More gunfire from the rocks and the sound of horses whinnying in fear. Someone was cutting the picket lines, scattering their mounts across the valley. The carefully orchestrated chaos was working exactly as planned. Zephyra struggled to her feet and ran toward the rocks where Dakota waited with a horse. Behind her, she could hear Ayanna and Hartwell fighting in the shallow water, their struggle punctuated by curses and the sound of fists meeting flesh. She reached the designated meeting point to find Dakota mounted and ready, his face pale but determined in the gathering darkness. She pressed the leather pouch into his hands and grabbed his stirrup. "Ride hard. Do not stop for anything. Find Judge Morrison and show him those papers. What about you and Father? We will find another way out." It was a lie, and they both knew it. But some lies were necessary to get people to do what needed to be done. Dakota leaned down and touched her face with his free hand, the gesture carrying all the gratitude and affection he could not take time to express in words. "You are family," he said simply. Then he was gone, riding hard into the darkness while behind them the sounds of conflict continued to echo off the canyon walls. Red Hawk's diversion was working, but it would not work forever. Soon the bounty hunters would regroup and realize they had been outmaneuvered. Zephyra made her way back toward the stream where Ayanna and Hartwell were still fighting. The Indian agent had gotten the upper hand and was pressing Ayanna's head beneath the water, but his wounded arm made his grip unstable. She picked up a rock the size of her fist and brought it down on the back of Hartwell's skull with all the force she could muster. He collapsed forward into the stream, unconscious but still breathing. Ayanna hauled himself out of the water, gasping and bleeding. from a cut above his eye. Around them, the gunfire was sporadic now, Red Hawk conserving his ammunition while the bounty hunters tried to determine where the shots were coming from. "Dakota?" Ayanna asked. "Gone, with the evidence." He nodded, water dripping from his hair and clothes. "Then we gave him his chance. What now?" Before he could answer, the scarred bounty hunter emerged from behind a boulder with his rifle trained on them both. His expression was grim, but not murderous. A man doing an unpleasant job rather than someone who enjoyed causing suffering. "That is enough," he said, "all of it." Behind him, the other bounty hunters appeared one by one, their weapons ready. But their enthusiasm for the fight clearly diminished. They had signed on to capture fugitives, not to participate in a massacre orchestrated by a corrupt government official. "What about him?" one of them asked, gesturing toward the unconscious. "Hartwell." The scarred man looked down at the Indian agent with obvious distaste. "What about him? Man who hires folks to commit murder does not deserve much consideration." He turned back to Zephyra and Ayanna, his rifle still ready but no longer aimed directly at them. "You folks got somewhere to go? Maybe. Then I suggest you get going. Before he wakes up and before someone else decides to make this situation more complicated than it already is." It was not forgiveness, exactly. But it was something close to justice, administered by men who had their own codes about right and wrong that did not always align with government papers and official authority. They helped each other up the rocky slope toward the caves where the children waited, leaving behind the stream where Hartwell lay unconscious and the bounty hunters debated what to do with a man who had hired them under false pretenses. Above them, stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and somewhere in that darkness, Dakota rode toward Abilene with evidence that might finally bring justice to men who thought themselves above the law. Whether that justice would come in time to save them remained to be seen. 6 months after Judge Morrison's ruling, the smell of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen window of the small ranch house that Ayanna and Zephyra had built with their own hands. The structure was simple but solid, constructed from timber they had cut themselves and stones they had gathered from the creek bed, where they had first learned to trust each other. The legal papers granting them homestead rights hung framed above the fireplace, signed by territorial authorities who had been eager to distance themselves from Hartwell's corruption once the full extent of his crimes became public knowledge. Ayanna's murder charges had been dismissed as justified self-defense. Zephyra's freedom had been legally recognized under territorial law. But the real transformation was visible in smaller details. The way Baby Crow ran to greet both parents when they returned from working in the fields. The sound of Little Fox practicing his letters at the kitchen table, his tongue sticking out in concentration as he formed words in English and Comanche. The quiet conversations between Ayanna's Dawn and Zephyra as they worked side by side, preparing medicine for the growing community of displaced people who had found sanctuary on their land. Dakota had grown 3 inches and gained the confidence that came from having ridden alone through dangerous territory to deliver evidence that brought down a corrupt government official. He now served as translator and guide for other young people who arrived at their door carrying their own stories of loss and displacement. The ranch had become something none of them had originally planned. A gathering place for former slaves, peaceful Native Americans, Mexican families fleeing violence, and others who existed in the spaces between the rigid categories that territorial law tried to impose on human complexity. Grandmother Sage had taken up residence in a small cabin near the main house, where she dispensed wisdom and herbal remedies with equal effectiveness. Her presence lent legitimacy to their unconventional community, her reputation for surviving impossible circumstances serving as a shield against those who might question their right to exist. Red Hawk came and went as his nature demanded, but always returned with news from the wider world and sometimes with new arrivals. who needed the kind of sanctuary that could only be provided by people who understood what it meant to be hunted. On this particular morning, Zephyra stood in her garden watching Ayana teach a group of children to ride bareback in the corral he had built behind the barn. The children were a mixture of backgrounds and languages, but on horseback they were simply young people learning to balance and trust and find joy in movement. She touched her throat where Samuel's tooth still hung on its thin chain, a constant reminder of love that death could not diminish. But now her other hand rested on her growing belly, where new life stirred with the promise of hope renewed. The pregnancy had surprised them both with its quiet arrival, noticed first when her monthly bleeding stopped and her appetite changed in ways that reminded her of a time she had tried not to remember. But this child would be born into freedom, surrounded by family that had been chosen rather than imposed by circumstances. Ayana noticed her watching and raised his hand in greeting, his smile carrying the contentment of a man who had found peace after years of running. The children waved too, their voices calling her name in a dozen different accents and languages. Little Fox broke away from the group and ran toward her, his energy inexhaustible despite the morning's exertion. He had grown close to her in the months since their escape from the caves, treating her with the easy affection of a child who had never known a time when she was not part of his family. "Mama Zephyra, Papa says you have news to tell us." The word mama still caught her by surprise, even after months of hearing it from lips that had every right to speak it. She had not asked for the title, but the children had bestowed it naturally, filling a role that had been empty in their lives and healing a wound in hers that she had thought would never close. "I do have news, but it should wait until everyone is together. Is it good news or worrying news?" "Good news. The kind that changes everything in the best possible way." He grinned and ran back toward the corral, shouting something in Comanche that made the other children laugh and cheer. Secrets were difficult to keep in a household where everyone had learned to read faces and moods for signs of danger or celebration. That evening, they gathered around the large table that Ayana had built to accommodate their extended family. The meal was simple but abundant. Vegetables from Zephyra's garden, combined with game that Red Hawk had brought and bread that Ayana's Dawn had learned to bake with increasing skill. The conversation flowed between English, Comanche, and Spanish, as naturally as water finding its course, everyone switching languages to include whoever needed inclusion at any given moment. It was the sound of a family that had been assembled from fragments, but had grown into something whole and strong. When the dishes had been cleared and the youngest children were growing drowsy in their chairs, Zephyra stood and looked around the table at faces that had become as familiar and precious as breathing. "We have something to tell you," she began. Ayana rising to stand beside her, his hand finding hers with the automatic gesture of partnership. "In the spring, our family will grow by one more." The announcement was met with a moment of silence as the words sank in, followed by an explosion of joy and questions and congratulations that filled the room with warmth. Baby Crow clapped his hands without fully understanding why everyone was celebrating. Little Fox asked if the baby would be a boy or girl and seemed disappointed that they could not provide an immediate answer. Dakota and Ayana's Dawn exchanged glances that spoke of shared responsibility and the quiet satisfaction of seeing their father happy in ways they had not thought possible since their mother's death. They had worked hard to make space in their hearts for Zephyra, and the evidence of her permanent place in their family felt like confirmation of choices well made. Grandmother Sage nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had seen the signs before anyone else and had been waiting for the announcement with patient certainty. Later, after the children had been settled for the night and the adults had dispersed to their various cabins and quarters, Zephyra and Ayana walked to the creek where their story had begun to change from survival to something richer and more complex. The water ran clear over stones that caught starlight and reflected it back in patterns that seemed to speak of continuity and hope. They sat on the bank where they had once planned desperate escapes and now planned for a future that stretched beyond the immediate needs of staying alive. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his arm around her shoulders as she leaned against his warmth. "Terrified," she admitted. "But not of the same things I used to fear." "What frightens you now?" "Being too happy, having too much to lose." "And what gives you courage?" She considered the question while listening to the night sounds around them. Owls calling to their mates, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant sound of one of the children talking in their sleep. Remembering where we came from, how we found each other. The fact that love grew in ground that had been poisoned by so much hatred. He kissed the top of her head, his lips warm against her hair. "Samuel would be proud of you." "I hope so." "I hope he knows that his death was not meaningless, that it led to something beautiful. He knows." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast Texas sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its voice carrying both loneliness and wildness across the prairie that had witnessed so much suffering, and was now witnessing the quiet miracle of healing. "What do you think Morning Star would say about all this?" Zephyra asked. "I think she would say that some seeds have to be buried deep before they can grow toward the light. And that sometimes, if you are blessed, someone believes you are worth digging up." They rose eventually and walked back toward the house where their children slept safe and warm, where tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys, where the future stretched ahead of them like an unwritten story full of possibility. The woman who had once been buried to her neck in hatred had grown into someone who planted gardens and raised children and built sanctuaries for other broken people seeking wholeness. The man who had lost everything to violence had learned to create rather than destroy, to nurture rather than seek revenge. Together, they had discovered that love was not just about finding someone to complete you, but about becoming someone worthy of completion. Not about escaping the past, but about transforming it into something that could nourish the future. In the spring, their child would be born into a world that was still dangerous and unjust, and filled with people who measured human worth by the color of skin or the language of prayer. But that child would also inherit a legacy of courage and compassion, of parents who had chosen hope over despair and family over fear. The garden would bloom again as it had every year since they had planted it. The children would grow and learn and eventually leave to build their own sanctuaries in places that needed them. The community would evolve and change as communities do, shaped by the people who chose to make it home. And in all of that growth and change and becoming, the truth would remain constant. That some things buried deep enough find the strength to grow toward the light. That some people, if they are blessed, discover others who believe they are worth digging up. That love, planted in ground prepared by suffering, can grow strong enough to shelter generations yet to come. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you, it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.